So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and today we're going to be going for another free-for-all, although this one is going to be on a very open and flat map. In fact, yes, it is Palinor Fields, and I figured that seeing as we'd gone through a few of the more unusual maps, it would be a good time to sort of take a break and go back to a battle in its most pure form without too much in the way of terrain. And obviously it is going to be a free-for-all, and that tends to mean that one player can't easily sit out a battle, although interestingly enough everyone is seemingly sort of deployed into 2v2s except for the player that sent in the replay to me, and that is DF Lister. We'll go through his army first of all, and this is good because obviously the most recent faction showcase I showed was Linden, so it'll be interesting to see how they manage in this free-for-all setting. We've got some Wardens of Harlingen over here, which are of course the Horse Archer Spear Cavalry hybrid, which of course can be quite effective, but they are also very expensive. Most of Linden's hybrid units do mean that you run up a bit of an expense quite quickly. And then we have the Midland Lancers, of course, the Jav Cav Lancer Cav hybrid as well. So based on his army, he's definitely gone a little bit more mobile, which potentially could work out quite nicely for him. He's got some Midland Nobles, so it'll be very interesting actually to see how well the Chariots get on in this battle, because they are seldom used, but we shall see. They could potentially be very devastating indeed. And then moving on to the Noldorin Horse Lords, of course, if you bring a cavalry-heavy Linden build, then these are going to be at the centre of most of everything you do, purely because they are, of course, the Knight unit, and this is going to be the General's Bodyguard as well, with the Bearded Elf. And they can be very, very strong, of course, but again, like most Linden units in comparison to the other Lancers, the lack of a shield and the lower armour does mean that archers can wear them down over time. We'll go through the cavalry as a whole before we get into his infantry corps. He's got some more Wardens of Harlingen and some more Midland Lancers, so a lot of money dumped into his cavalry. This is a relatively high funds game, I would imagine, considering the army's on display, so it'll be very interesting to see what people have brought. Some Midland Swordmasters, of course, these guys can be really good damage dealers in melee, but again, arrows are going to be their primary weakness. And then we can see some 4 Linden Marines back here again. The Javelin Spear hybrid, very, very powerful, often brought by Linden players just because of their utility. Very, very useful for zoning out cavalry and then being committed to infantry fights later on. Harlingen infantry as well are the other common pick, as I said back in the Linden faction showcase, because they are just such a solid frontline troop. And then backing them up we have the Noldorin Guard to inspire, which will essentially make the elves unbreakable. I mean, you can break them, but most of the time, by the time that happens, the battle will be over, especially with the inspiration units over here and the very high base morale that the elves are blessed with. Some Midland Swordmasters, and again another high tier unit here in the Noldorin Blade Masters. They could potentially be a bit of a swing unit in melee, and then another unit for Linden Marines. But yeah, this is a small infantry corps. He does have a couple of Swordmasters, the Blade Masters, the Guard, and a couple of Javelins, but most of the power is going to be coming from the cavalry. So let's see his would-be opponent. This is the player that sort of banked up to come after him, and it is going to be Rory Hannon 2016, and he is playing as Rohan. We've got some Arid of Aldberg over here, which are some of the better Lancers in Rohan's very large selection of said unit. But yeah, they should be able to do pretty decently if they can get a nice charge off against Linden, but Linden of course does have the tools to deal with cavalry for the most part. One unit which they may find a little bit more difficult to handle, however, will be the Riders of the Fold. They will trade relatively efficiently with most Linden units. Now, of course, they will still take a few casualties going up against Linden, the Linden Horse Archers in particular, especially if the Linden Horse Archers decide to turn around and charge into them with their Spear Cavalry traits. But the Riders of the Fold is still a very, very solid pick from Rohan. And actually, it looks like they've gone more infantry heavy, which is interesting. We've got some Westmark Marshals over here, previously known as the Marshals of the Red. Their AP isn't going to be too useful against Linden as such, unless they can get into the Noldorin Guard. They are still the primary damage dealers on the Rohan line. They are the unit of highest quality, which is capable of dishing out a lot of damage. Obviously, there is the Hornberg Guard as well. We'll get onto them in just a moment. Helmingas forming up the bulk of the archer line at the front, and they also have the more basic Riddermark archers here, of course. Now, these should trade. Both of these units should trade relatively evenly with Linden's archer force, especially considering that they only have horse archers as their range contingent. So it'll be very interesting to see how Linden deal with that should Rohan move forward. Back here, however, we do have the Riddermark Axemen. So again, a lot of AP here, which does mean that a lot of their traits are going to be wasted if they do go after Linden. They are high damage infantry, so perhaps they could sort of even that out with just simply having high base attack. Another unit of Riddermark Axemen there, another unit of Westmark Marshals, and then back over here, this is the other unit which can do a lot of damage in Rohan's infantry line, the Hornberg Sentries, of course. But again, they are geared a little bit more to armoured units, and even more so here because they don't have the same sort of base attack numbers as a two-handed Axeman unit would have. This is going to be much more similar to something like the Gwaith Emir Dane from Imladris, although a little bit more of a focus around their own armour and that big shield that they carry. Could potentially be useful in the late game should they be facing down a more heavily armoured faction as time goes on. Over here we have the Red Shield of Erkenbrand, the sort of heavily armoured melee cav horse archer hybrid. It'll be interesting to see how they do. A lot of people have been quite critical of them in the past, and I would agree with them. But we'll see if the changes have sort of made a big difference to how they perform in this battle, because they could potentially be very useful against Linden. We've also got the first Marshals Bodyguard and the Sons of Yule, so multiple HP Lancers that are quite swift, balanced out by the Knight unit, which is slower but obviously stronger in most aspects of their stats. And then finally we shall get over to the other armies which are already facing off against one another. We shall start off with Dreezy of the Dark Cloud playing as Rune, and of course he has got the Golden Boys in full force. He's got the Flag Rim and the Scion Rim just in front of them, and they are going to be backed up by a unit of Eastron Clansmen with both levels of armour upgrades. Just before we missed them over here, I believe, based on the fact this is the General's Bodyguard, indeed it is the Dragon's Wrath Warlord, so again multiple HP Lancers. They do need to stay away from the various Knight units that are on the field, but if they do, they should perform quite solidly. And then getting back into the Runic core, which often turns out to be very solid. We've got a lot of Gamprim and of course more Clansmen. Deploying his stakes behind him so he can't be easily rear-charged with these Loknar Rim. And then in the centre of his infantry corps we have the Cardinals chosen to keep everything in check. Just back here we can see some Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen which have revealed themselves, and also some Balchoth Tribesmen for those Javelins, and I believe it's going to be a similar story over here with Flag Rim and Scion Rim, and actually another unit of Flag Rim there, but also a unit of Inas Rim over on this side. And then the final army which we will be seeing today is going to be White Wolf, who is commanding the Misty Mountains, and of course some Black Uruks. The Mountains, one of the genuinely decent units in terms of stats that the Misty Mountains have, not overly reliant on their, well, Misty Mountains are a faction which obviously relies heavily on their numbers, but the Black Uruks are one that actually does have some decent stats to go along with their high numbers. Goblin Archers at the front again. It's very difficult to skirmish down with the Misty Mountains simply because they've got so many disposable goblins they can throw at your archers. Heavy Goblin Spears, of course. And then, of course, the White Uruk Fearmongers, which, again, you can only have one now, but they do still make a very solid centre to your line. So, again, we've got a lot of AP here. Heavy Goblin Spears. Now, Rune don't have as higher armour values as some of the other Kingdoms of Men, but all of this AP is still going to be very useful for equalising with some of the higher tier Runic units. So Heavy Goblin Infantry as well, just some throwaway units that they can use. And then back here, a unit of Snow Trolls, a unit of Cave Troll Drummers, and standard Cave Trolls. And then back here we have the Mounted Contingent, 2 Warg Riders, and the Bold Champions. And we may as well stay over here for the start of the battle, seeing as this is almost certainly going to be the ones who engage with one another first, unless Rohan very quickly closes the gap. And it does actually look as though Linden are coming over to try and attack Rune in the rear, which, again, this is interesting because Rune is now the player who is going to be the focal point of this battle. He needs to decide what he's going to do. If I were him, I would probably try and reposition myself so that I was over here. So this way Linden and the Misty Mountains could not really easily avoid one another as they came towards me. Because the player that this is going to benefit most of all from the start here is going to be Rohan. They're going to be delighted with the fact that Linden appears to be moving over here, although it does look as though Linden has sort of stopped and is forming up to try and face Rohan now. Interesting. Column formations coming forward as the Goblins attack en masse. Just need to make sure that we're not going to be missing anything over here. Now the Aerid of Oldberg and the Riders of the Fold are coming forward. Now this is bold considering they don't have the security of the heavier hitting Rohan cavalry with them. And the Wardens of Harlingen, 2 units of Wardens of Harlingen will be more than sufficient to deal with the Riders of the Fold. And the Aerid of Oldberg is charging in, but they need to be careful in the presence of that Spear Cavalry hybrid there. So we have a look over here, we shall actually lower the speed just a little bit. Now the Midland Lancers are throwing their Javelins in, but of course they are not Spear Cavalry hybrids, they are Lancers just like the Aerid of Oldberg in melee. And seeing as the Aerid got their charge off, they should be able to do a decent amount of damage, but they do need to be careful of the Wardens of Harlingen. Let's make sure we're not missing anything over here. And indeed, the Goblin Archers getting right up into the face of the Runic soldiers. Now that's an interesting choice. The Misty Mountains, of course, are just sort of going for that mad scramble tactic where they charge forward, so there's obviously going to be some sort of inconsistencies in their line. But Rune have sort of... I'm always a little bit wary when someone sort of bends their line in preparation to try and deal with the orcs, but we shall see. Now this is not the best idea in my opinion. The Dragon's Wrath Warlords, if you lose your general in an engagement like this, you've only got yourself to blame. The Bolg's champions are designed from the ground up to be anti-cavalry killing machines. And the Dragon's Wrath Warlords are not knights, so they won't even be able to take too much of a chunk out of the Bolg's champions themselves. The charge is really what you're going to be relying on, but the multiple HP nature of the Bolg's champions means they're going to be able to absorb a great deal of that damage. The Snow Trolls are coming in here, but they shouldn't really last all that long. There's no real skirmishes they can go after in here, so a bit of a waste, as the Flag Rim and Scion Rim, backed up by those clansmen, are likely going to be enough to take them down. The Wardens of Harlingen, having to deal with some pressure from the 1st Marshal's bodyguard. There's also some Sons of Yorl and the Riders of the Fold. What happened to the Arid of Aldberg? They're over here, they're idle. There's not really a huge amount of casualties either way over here so far. It's mainly cavalry, and the cavalry fight will decide a great deal. I think it's more important actually that Linden get the better of this cavalry engagement, because Rohan have got a lot of infantry that they can use to potentially surround Linden here. Linden don't have the most foot soldiers. They definitely need their cavalry to do some work here, and then they should be able to rely on their infantry's overall quality and their javelins to really do some high damage against the Rohan two-handed axemen. But for the time being, it is just going to be a case of cavalry skirmishing off against one another. Now as we move back over to here, the frontline engagement has begun. The Eastron clansmen are going to be trying to take the bulk of the casualties. The heavy goblin spears are here. They're going to need some backup, and they are going to get it in the shape of some basic goblin infantry. The cave troll drummers are moving in here, and this is not the best idea. The cave troll drummers don't have very good melee stats, and the Gamp Rim will likely be sufficient to poke them to death, and losing the cave troll drummers this early would be a real shame. And indeed they are sort of getting back out of combat now. The Goblin Archers showering arrows down onto the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen and the local Nar Rim. Nar Rim, of course, without a shield. The Variag mercenary archers probably would have been a better choice in this situation against the Goblins. Here come the Cave Trolls, of course, all 20 of them crashing in. Again, this is not really the best position of the line for them to go for, though, however. It is a thick part of the line, and there's no skirmishes really behind there. What is going on over here? Looks like the Wargs are coming in, and the standard Warg Riders are going to make mincemeat of the Inas Rim. Rune going primarily for their Lancer cavalry here, and that will be exactly the sort of thing that the Orcs like fighting against. The Wargs love fighting Lancers. White Uruk Fearmongers coming in here as well. So a bit of a mixed bag over here so far between Linden and the Misty Mountains. The Misty Mountains will probably overall be able to absorb their mistakes a little bit easier than Rohan will, especially when you see this sort of thing in the rear lines, now that the Misty Mountains, they've also cut down the enemy general. When the Wargs have got sort of superiority over the back lines, I can't imagine Rune are going to last all that much longer, to be honest with you. I think the Misty Mountains are going to be just fine. You can see also the heavy goblin spears are pushing in. These Carmel's Chosen need to get into the fight somewhere, and also those White Uruk Fearmongers are going to be pretty lethal. But yeah, I think that Rune, they set up a decent defence, but ultimately it didn't have enough width. And the Misty Mountains, I think, are just going to be able to clamp down on both sides, and the cavalry picks honestly weren't really the best from either side. Now, interestingly enough, Rohan is more eager to force the infantry to get involved earlier, which is a good move on their part, I think, because they certainly have more infantry to burn. They also have more foot archers, and as soon as their foot archers can support their cavalry here, it is going to be quite difficult for Linden to get much value off their cavalry, of course, because anything but their Noldorin Horse Lords is going to struggle pretty severely as the Linden infantry comes in. Ooh, that lag though. Mythalon Nobles charging in. Unfortunately, if they get caught on the Arid of Oldberg for too long, they will fall away. They do have 4 HP, but if they stop like they're doing now, it's going to be bad for them. They are sort of pushing in, however, as they get into these Helmingas. In fact, I think we will just turn the speed down again. Everything's happening all at once. But the Chariots actually managing to escape the Rohan cavalry, and now they're charging in through the Helmingas and into the Westmark Marshals, one of the more dangerous Rohan infantry units that they have brought, and they're just going to charge right on through. So they managed to get them away. If they stayed in combat there for a little bit too much, well, for too much longer, they would have been in a lot of trouble. Now here the Mythalon Swordmasters have caught the Arid of Oldberg. They need to get out of there. Rohan's cavalry needs to be careful. They've got the Sons of Yorl. The Red Shields are still firing their projectiles, but how is the frontline fight going to go? Now Rohan, they need to use their numbers here to try and wrap around the enemy. I know the cavalry is present, but this already is not looking good for Rohan, because with those Chariots in behind, the hammer and anvil charges that Chariots can deliver are going to be absolutely lethal. especially seeing as the kind of infantry that Rohan has brought, primarily AP axes, are not really going to be the most efficient against all of Linden's infantry. None of it really is going to be yielding too much ground to that sort of thing, other than the Noldering Guard, and they are going to be saturated in with the Harlanden infantry. Mithlon nobles charging right through the centre of that Rohan line, bisecting the entire army, and at this point the Linden cavalry is going to have superiority over the back lines of Rohan, and then the advantage in numbers that Rohan's infantry had is not going to count for a whole lot. They do still have those red shields. Those Mithlon Lancers have pulled out very wide. They're actually being pursued by something. The 1st Marshal's bodyguard trying to hunt them down. I mean, honestly, the 1st Marshal's bodyguard needs to get back. Rohan need to try and turn this fight around somehow, but yeah, the Riddermark Axemen routing off. Fantastic to see the chariots used to their full effect there, because the chariot's definitely a big part in how Rohan's infantry is essentially falling apart. Let's move back over to this side of the battlefield. And Rune are actually holding up better than I thought they would, although I do still think that the Warg's backline superiority here is going to tell in the long run. The heavy Goblin spears coming in with some Wargs charging into the back of the clansmen. Of course, they will fall away relatively quickly, but the Scion Rim are holding. But they're not going to be able to kill off the goblins quickly enough, because obviously there are those black Uruks in there, and spearmen don't get their killing done quickly, at least not the Scion Rim. There are exceptions to every rule, of course. Ooh, Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen over here. The Warg Riders are charging in, and the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, I think, were trying to throw their projectiles, but at this point it might be worth Rohan's time to try and maybe get these Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen away and hidden, and then maybe they can swoop in the late game if it is sufficiently close for them to take advantage of such things. Here we can see the Scion Rim fighting hard on the front line against these Black Uruks, but again, it's the same problem over here. The Scion Rim are a good line-holding infantry unit, but the vast majority of the Flag Rim that were backing them up have perished, which does mean that, you know, ultimately the Goblins are going to be able to overwhelm. And over here you can see where the White Uruk Fearmongers are. They've just managed to punch a hole clean through the runic front line. The Gamp Rim not able to hold up for too long. They have managed to hold parts of their line together, but ultimately the concentration of force in several areas from the Misty Mountains has served them pretty well. I think now it's going to be a case of whether or not they have the numbers sufficient to try and deal with Linden, because Linden are almost certainly going to be victorious over here. The chariots are running rampant. The Riddermark archers are getting cut down in melee by swordmasters. There are the Hornberg sentries over here, but that isn't going to count for a great deal here. AP units, I'm a little bit confused as to why Rohan went so AP heavy, because really, other than the Misty Mountains, you wouldn't have been able to swing an entire battle based on AP alone. Rune have decent arm values, but it's not high enough to the point where it would justify this many, and obviously, you know, bringing AP units against Linden is not really necessary at all. Then again, Rohan don't really have much in the way of infantry units that are actually decent without AP, so I suppose there is that. Would have been a good time to see the Westmark swordsman there. Here we can see the Mithlon Lancers. There is still Rohan cavalry hovering around. There's the red shields. The Sons of Yorl are over here as well, which could potentially be a bit of a difficult one. Well, I say that, there's only 8 of them remaining. They're in full range of the Forlinder Marines, and they were up against Spear Cavalry in the Wardens of Harlanden, so ultimately the Sons of Yorl are probably going to fall away here. Those Mithlon Lancers are back there. The red shields are going to be the only thing left, really, of Rohan as this fight continues, but it's really nice to see the chariots used well. Very often they will be wasted, but here Lister has managed to use the chariots to very good effect. Rohan had they had to use that. If they were going to be victorious here, they needed to use their numbers to wrap around. But ultimately they didn't do that. The engagement was nice and narrow, which is exactly the sort of thing Linden is going to want in this situation. And Nolder and Blade Masters are going to be able to kill Riddermark Axemen all day long. Forlinder Marines also in melee. Maybe not ideal for them, especially seeing as they're up against Westmark Marshals. And Rohan are bringing more and more infantry over here. But the rest of Rohan's line has fallen apart. Let's go back over to here, and it looks as though the Misty Mountains are just sort of wrapping up their victory over here as well. The Cave Trolls charging into the backs of the runic ranks. And yeah, Rune set out to be quite defensive, I think, and ultimately the cavalry was such a one-sided victory in favour of the Misty Mountains that when you have to deal with cavalry in your back lines, it can be a real nightmare. But Rune, again, probably should have seen this coming. Going for all Lancers when the other teams on the field are Linden, Rohan and the Misty Mountains, all of which could lay down some really nice cav-to-cav superiority. I'm a little bit surprised Rune didn't go for maybe the clan chiefs. Some nice spear cavalry, and I'm very surprised they didn't go for the dragon knights. But they wanted to save money and invest elsewhere, but that hasn't really panned out for them. A unit like the Carmel's Chosen is very good in the right situation, but here, especially when it's facing down so much AP and it's outnumbered so heavily, it's not going to go well for them. What's going on over here? We have the Warg Riders, who are out here with the Bulk Champions. Bulk Champions still in decent health. The Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen are still trying so desperately to get away, and maybe this is what Dreezy is trying to do, trying to hide his Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen for the late game, but the Misty Mountains are having none of it by the looks of things. Eastron Clansmen running. Warg Riders are probably going to get another rear charge in here. Indeed they are, so let's go up to 1 speed again, and this is probably going to be enough to finish off the last of the runic resistance over here. As the Wargs come in, getting up to charge speed. Yep, that is going to rout them. Let's go back over here and see what sort of last stand Rohan are going to be able to put together. The Noldorin Horse Lords are here, so the Wardens of Harland and the first Marshal's Bodyguard are charging in, but how much damage they can do is probably limited. They should probably be trying to thin out some of the Linden infantry units, to be honest, because Linden have managed to just lay down such a hurting on the Rohan infantry line. This sort of Rohan infantry is going to do very well against someone, potentially well against other good kingdoms of men, or even the dwarves. But Linden, it's exactly the sort of units you don't want to bring against Linden. And here come the Mithlon Nobles. They have lost a chariot by the looks of things, or 2, based on the unit count. Charging in, you can hear the elephant sound effects there, because they do count as elephants. That's what gives them the mass capable of just sort of charging through lines. Yeah, Rohan's infantry is obviously falling apart very, very quickly. Wardens of Harland, do they have any other cavalry? They do have the Red Shields. The Red Shields are melee cav, so they're not going to be the easiest thing to bring down in melee, but with all of the spear cavalry and with the Noldorin Horse Lords, which are surely still milling around here somewhere, they should be able to just simply overwhelm the Red Shields. What are the Red Shields going to go for here? They could have bogged down the chariots there. There are the Wardens. I'm glad that I did this replay now, so that we can see the chariots in full effect. Let's ride with the Red Shields as they try and put up a valiant last stand. They don't have the highest charge, and they didn't connect very well with those Noldorin Guard. There goes the Rohan General at the hands of the Noldorin Guard. Well, they could cycle charge in and out, but again, Linden using their javelins. Noldorin Horse Lords coming in. Yeah, and the Red Shields are routing, so that could be it for Rohan, actually. I don't think they've got anything else left. So Rohan have been defeated. Linden just tidying up now, and I think it's the same story over here. Well, there are still some Carmel's Chosen in amongst this mosh pit of goblins over here. But they won't be lasting too much longer. But credit to them here, because this obviously shows what an elite infantry unit is capable of. They're not going to be routing, and they're still going to be putting up a fight. Well, that is the end of Rohan then. So we sort of look down from on high here at the churning mass. The best of Rune's infantry is not going to be able to fight their way out of this one. But just having a look, I do think Rune has managed to inflict significantly more casualties on the Misty Mountains than Rohan was able to on Linden in relative terms. And I'm not sure if the Misty Mountains has got the tools required to deal with Linden. Linden's infantry is still in pretty good shape, and I don't think the Goblins are going to enjoy facing off against units like Noldorin Guard and Noldorin Blade Masters too much. The Volks Champions, though, you know, they with their anti-cavalry, they should be able to put up a decent fight against something like the Horse Lords and over these strong clansmen. Do Rune still have units left? They do. They do have these Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. They actually managed to finish off this unit of Wargs over here, or at least force them to retreat. It'll be interesting to see if they actually come back into the game later on. We shall see. So yeah, based on the casualties that have been inflicted, I think Linden are going to be victorious here. I mean, this is still a lot of goblins, but again, a lot of their stronger units, like the heavy goblin spears and the white Uruk Fearmongers, have got a little bit more going on in the AP department, which is not going to be helpful against Linden. We've got some goblin archers as well, which look like they're out of ammunition based on the fact that they were committed. Still a few trolls, but let's just bump this up to 2 speed for a bit. Old champion, still some units retreating all over the place. You can see Linden. Linden would be well advised to stretch the battlefield as well. Individually, of course, their units are going to be far in excess of the quality that the Misty Mountains have got left. And that they brought at all, to be honest with you. I mean, the White Uruk Fearmongers and the Black Uruks, the Mountains are decent, but they spent a lot of their money on Trolls and Bolg's Champion, well, and their Wargs overall. They don't have very many Trolls left at all. Let's go and have a look at what Linden actually have left. So they've got some Cavalry, 3 units of Cavalry. Well, actually, they've got some Cavalry over there. That's Chariots, actually. Get my story straight. So 3 somewhat battered units of Cavalry. Some Chariots over on this side. They don't have all that much infantry left. I mean, it doesn't look like much, but individually these units are obviously very, very strong. Noldering Guard and Blade Masters in particular, I'm not sure whether the Misty Mountains are going to have what it takes to beat them. They're going to definitely need the help of their wargs recharging into them if they want to win this fight. Noldering Guard won't like facing off against the Misty Mountains AP units, however, so that might be in their favour. But other than that, they've still got some units which are going to enjoy facing off against all of these goblins. And those chariots as well. I mean, those chariots could yet still prove their usefulness. Not exactly the most lore-friendly clash on the Palinor fields this, the goblins from the Misty Mountains going up against the elves of Linden, but we make do with what we have. Minas Tirith in the background. But yeah, I mean, I think that Linden's cavalry presence is enough to the point where the Misty Mountains are not going to be able to use their wargs to the extent that they're needed to get into the rear lines of Linden to force a victory here for the Misty Mountains. Of course, there are still those Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, which I don't think are going to be proved to be too much of a factor here. Could be wrong, but I don't think there's enough of them. And also, based on the time left, I don't think the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen can actually run their way over here in time. So I imagine the ruling player is probably just going to admit defeat. Let's go back up to time 6 speed. Wait for the battle to begin. There's definitely not going to be the longest battle when it's joined, which doesn't bode well for the goblins. The goblins are moving forward. Now, the good thing for them, of course, is that Linden don't have any foot archers left. I'm not sure if the Wardens of Harlingen still have any ammunition. It doesn't look like it because they've got their spears out. So they don't have anything really in the way of ranged units. Neither do the Misty Mountains, but of course Elven archers are not something you want hounding you on your approach. The javelins, of course. Ooh, my bad. Javelins trying to throw into the White Uruk Fearmongers, of course, the most dangerous unit that the Misty Mountains have left really on foot. They do have some javelins left, which again, that's more points in favour of Linden here. Linden have set out their stall. Might be worth, well, I was about to say it might be worth Linden's time to take the aggressive stance here, but I guess there's no need. Is 4 Linden Marines going to fire when they get into range? Probably not the heavy goblin spears, not really too much of a threat to most of the Linden line. Speaking of which, Harlingen infantry, they're not going to have too much of a problem facing off against heavy goblin spears. They charge in. Now the Noldering Guard may take a few casualties, but 1 unit of heavy goblin spears with their AP is not going to be enough to defeat a whole unit of quality elven soldiers. Black Uruks, the Mountains, they're good, but they're not as good as Midland Swordmasters, so yeah, all along the line Linden have got a quality advantage. They need to get up and around the sides here, the Misty Mountains. They're making the same mistake really that Rohan did in allowing a narrow engagement. They're also charging headlong into the Noldorin Horse Lords with one of their units, which would actually do okay on the front line, getting flattened by the Noldorin Horse Lords there. The Bolg Champions need to shut down the Linden Cavalry very, very quickly. There is a lot of goblins. I mean, if they were to get around the side here, I would actually say they probably stand quite a good chance of winning this. But as it stands, now this could well be the engagement which makes or breaks the Misty Mountains. Bolg Champions versus what's left of the Noldorin Horse Lords, but with the Mithlon Nobles giving them a hand, a few javelins being thrown, well, they're not going to enjoy being in melee, and you can see that this is where the Mithlon Nobles start to melt. That's the danger of chariot units, but they've already paid for themselves. And actually the Bolg Champions forcing a retreat from the Noldorin Horse Lords. The Trolls are here as well, Noldorin Blade Masters. Yeah, you know, if If the Misty Mountains had just spread their line a little bit wider, they could have had this one, I think. The Warg Riders have been victorious against all facets of the Linden Cavalry. And now they need to get in and recharge these lines quickly, because otherwise they are going to run out of manpower, and as soon as the Misty Mountains line starts to fall apart, it's going to be all over. Bolg's champions there. Noldorin Horse Lords. Bolg's champions wanting to go back. Well, there goes the Misty Mountains general. So the Noldorin Horse Lords proving that they're no slouches in melee. There are the Blade Masters. Rear charges, but here you can see this is where the Misty Mountains line has fallen apart first of all. The Warg Riders desperately need to assist their troops. I mean, the Misty Mountains did technically push through a little bit, and using their mass against a faction as lightweight as Linden is a good move, but I think spreading wider might have been the way to go. Trying to get in and around the back. Just with a couple of units. Because obviously you still need a bit of density on your front line to withstand the Elven skill in melee. The Noldorin Horse Lords getting a nice rear charge there into the Goblin Archers, forcing a rout, and they can't afford to lose that much cannon fodder. Warg Riders hunting them down, but the Elven Cavalry is swift and fast, and when there's that few of them, they're going to be able to wriggle free of a great many engagements. These Mithlon Swordmasters holding back a ton of troops as well. There's a lot of goblins that are routing. Goblin infantry is routing off as well. The Warg Riders are in here. They don't want to be in a sustained melee with the Noldorin Guard, and also there's the Noldorin Blade Masters over here, and none of the Misty Mountains units left are going to be a match for them, to be honest with you. And now they have admitted defeat, actually, the Misty Mountains. So he saw which way the wind was blowing, and yeah, after the breaking, there was no chance he was going to be able to turn that around. A bit of a shame. He did stand a bit of a chance there in the late game, but ultimately Linden's quality units were too much. Although their cavalry did fall away quicker than I was expecting. And I think the Runic player is also going to admit defeat here as well, because he's got a unit tucked away over there in the corner. Yep, Linden victorious just after their faction showcase at that. In fact, I think he might have crashed based on the fact that the replay is finished, so I don't think we're going to be able to see the stats, which means we won't be able to see how many kills the Chariots got, which is a real shame. Because they were definitely a big part of why Rohan collapsed so completely in the face of Linden, charging right on through. They were in danger of getting bogged down, but they worked. So not only was this a good follow-up to the Linden faction showcase, but for once I actually got to see the Chariots in action as they are intended to be used. So yeah, still a very risky unit, but you can potentially inflict wounds on your enemy, like those that you saw the Chariots inflict on Rohan here. Yeah, I hope you found this somewhat entertaining, and next up we will be returning to the faction showcases, of course, and it will be Umbar. So yeah, I hope you'll join me for that, and I hope you enjoyed this.